Good evening and welcome to Dark Historian. You're in a quiet place now, made for slow stories, soft thoughts, and peaceful sleep. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let the day gently fade away. Tonight, we'll explore the quieter side of history, simple lives, strange old customs, and forgotten moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. If this calm journey brings you peace or helps you rest, feel free to like or subscribe, only if it feels. Right now, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The Great Lice Migration, Hygiene and Hair on the High Plains Dust. Sweat and itch. When clean was just a word. Asterisk, you don't notice the dirt at first. It begins as a film, a fine layer of dust on your sleeves, your face, the creases of your hands. Then it settles deeper, into your scalp, your socks, the inner lining of your collar. On the Oregon Trail, you didn't get dirty in a moment. You became dirty gradually and then stayed that way. The illusion of clean back home, you bathed weekly, sometimes more. A wash tub, heated water, soap that smelled faintly of lye and lavender. But out here, clean became a memory, a fantasy, something you remembered from other people's stories. You didn't chase it, you just adjusted to its absence. Water was for drinking. Every drop mattered. Water fetched with effort, guarded carefully, boiled reluctantly. You didn't waste it on your skin. If there was enough for the oxen and the coffee, you were lucky. If not, you rationed, and your body carried the cost. Sponge baths with cold hands. Sometimes you wiped yourself down, a damp rag, a splash from a tin basin. You started with your face, then neck, armpits, if brave, feet, if desperate. The water turned grey instantly. You wrung the cloth out, looked at your arms, and felt slightly better, not clean, but better. Soap was a precious, crumbling cake. You brought soap, maybe 2 bars. Homemade, yellow, harsh on the skin. It cracked quickly, got lost easily. Melted if packed near heat. You used it sparingly. Dabbing, not lathering. The idea of a full-body soap scrub felt like fantasy. You saved it for laundry, or for when you smelled too strongly, even to yourself. Sweat became your second skin. Every step raised dust. Every hour brought sweat. Your shirt clung, then dried, then clung again. By noon, your back was soaked. By sunset, it had stiffened into salt. You scratched without realizing it. The sweat never really left. It just changed shape. Hair was a tangled mystery. You didn't comb it every day. There was no point. It tangled with wind, with sleep, with each. Other men let it grow wild. Women braided it, rebraided it, tied it with scrap cloth. Children had nests of curls, full of crumbs and dust. Hair was no longer for beauty. It was just there, like your shadow. Hats were hygiene hat, protected your scalp, hid the worst of the grime. It kept sunburn at bay, collected the first sweat. Sometimes it made things worse, trapping heat. But you wore it anyway, because without it, your head felt exposed, and your filth more visible. The arrival of the itchit always began the same way. A spot behind the ear, a tickle at the back of the neck, then a line of red bumps, a patch of raised skin, a sleepless night of scratching. The lice had arrived. The lice were not surprising. No one gasped. No one panicked. They were expected, like thirst, like fatigue. You felt shame at first, then nothing, because everyone had them. The lice found. Everyone rich, poor, old, young. You could have silk gloves and still find them nesting behind your collar. They didn't discriminate. They migrated from child to sibling, from bedroll to bonnet, from scalp to scalp dot. Fleas came to sometimes. It wasn't lice, it was fleas. They lived in blankets, crawled into boots, bit ankles and thighs. You woke scratching. You beat your back before sleeping. You burned the corners of your quilts. It didn't stop them. Remedies from the old country people tried everything. Ash mixed with lard, vinegar rubbed into the scalp. Camphor oil, if you had it. Some shaved their heads. Others braided tightly and hoped. You washed combs in boiling water. You whispered about it. Rarely spoke aloud, because there was no cure, just effort. The community itch at night. Round the fire, you'd see others scratch. A shoulder twist, a subtle reach behind the neck. You mirrored them. No one mentioned it. It was like yawning, contagious, acceptable, universal. Washing clothes was washing yourself. You didn't wash your body often, but you washed your clothes. Not because they were truly cleanable, but because it made you feel cleaner by association. You beat the dust out, hung them to dry, put them back on, still damp. Better than nothing, the scent of the trail you smelled. Everyone did, a mix of wood smoke, grease, wool, and dust. It was sharp at first, then softened, then faded. You only noticed it again when you met someone from another wagon train. They smelled different, strange, foreign. You realized they thought the same about you. The luxury of a creek every few weeks. If luck favored you, you found a slow-moving creek. You stripped to your underclothes, waded in, let the cold bite. You scrubbed your arms, your face, maybe even your scalp. You came out shivering, grinning, almost reborn. Shared combs, quiet baths, and the dignity of grooming together asterisk on the Oregon Trail. Hygiene wasn't about luxury, it was about small victories. It was about warmth in a wash basin, a clean shirt on Sunday, a brush passed hand to hand in the fading light. It wasn't about beauty. It was about feeling human in a world that reduced everything to function. This is the story of how people cleaned themselves and each other with limited water. No privacy and infinite care. One basin, many faces water was precious. Bowls were few, so when someone washed, they washed fast. Then passed the basin, father to son, sister to sister. You didn't complain about the color of the water. You used it quickly. You used it gratefully, because at least it was warm. The communal brush. There was usually one good brush. It lived in a small pouch, carried between wagons. Everyone used it carefully. Quietly, hair was pulled back tight afterward. Braids retied. The brush passed hands like a spoon or a ladle. Not sacred, but necessary combing, as conversation even in brought the brush out. A mother brushed her daughter's hair. A sister detangled her brother's knots. There was no hurry, no embarrassment. It was one of the few tasks that allowed for stillness. 4. Stories. For comfort, you pulled gently. You smoothed with your hand, and you listened. Men groomed. 2 beards were trimmed with knives, mustaches wiped with grease or ash. Some men shaved, but rarely. Most let the hair grow, then clipped it short when it got in the way. They groomed not for looks, but for sanity. The act of shaving reminded them they still had control. A mirror was a treasure. Most wagons carried at least one. Small metal, scratched. With use, you held it in one hand and squinted into it, hoping for good light. You checked your teeth, your eyes. your skin, not out of vanity, but to remember what you looked like, to prove you still existed. Sunday was for cleanliness. Southern those without religion treated Sunday differently. You washed your face, you changed your shirt, you rebraided your hair. The goal wasn't purity, it was pause, the chance to feel like yourself, to look like yourself, just for a little while. Feet were special. You cared for your feet more than anything. Blisters cleaned, socks aired, boots scraped out. Someone always had a tin of grease. You rubbed it in slowly. Feet were survival, and taking care of them was both ritual and respect. The quiet, shaving circle men sat near the fire with razors and water cups. They didn't speak much, just scraped carefully, wiped the blade on a cloth, dipped again. You watched each other, not to compete, but to remember you were still men, capable, present, steady, even if your hands shook. Lice checks were love. You sat between someone's knees. They parted your hair, looked carefully. Sometimes they crushed one between their nails. Sometimes they sighed and reached for vinegar. It wasn't shameful, it was care. Rags hung like flags, clothes and linens hung between wagons on rope. White turned to beige. Flannel stiffened in the sun. They swayed in the wind, like banners of quiet resistance, a sign that someone had taken the time to wash. To believe cleanliness still mattered. Bathing in pairs when the water was plentiful. People bathed not alone, in twos, in threes, not for modesty, but for help. Someone poured, someone scrubbed you, closed your eyes, took a deep breath, let the water run down your back. You were not clean when you emerged, but you felt closer to it. Soap sharing without shame. If someone had soap, they shared it. A pinch, a swipe, a wet bar passed hand to hand. Soap was valuable, but it wasn't hoarded, because everyone needed it, and no one forgot the one who shared. Fingernails and firelight fingernails gathered grime, so you sat near the fire with a pin or knife and scraped the dirt out. Sometimes you helped others, small fingers, elderly hands. The gesture was quiet, intimate, ordinary, but it mattered. Scrubbing without judgments. Some were cleaner than others. Some always smelled faintly of lye, others of onions and grease. But no one mocked. Everyone understood. If you had time to clean, it meant something else had gone well. It meant you weren't nursing the sick, or fixing a broken wheel, or grieving. Borrowed shirts, borrowed scents. You wore someone else's shirt once. It smelled like their wagon, their smoke, their way of life. It reminded you that every person was their own weather system, that cleanliness had many definitions. Braiding in a line before sleep. Girls sat in rows, each one braiding the next, working slowly, carefully. It was not for style, it was for neatness. Order, a small thread of normalcy, a row of bent heads, firelight flickering on hair made glossy by sweat and dust. Clean enough to keep going. Quiet grace. In a world of dust. Asterisk, there were no spas on the Oregon Trail. No perfumed soaps. No velvet towels. And yet, there were moments of real, quiet grace. When someone ran a damp cloth down the back of your neck. When a child sat still while you combed out the knots. When someone offered you a clean rag, or their last pinch of vinegar. Out here, those moments mattered more than meals. They were a reminder that you were more than a body moving west. You were a person worth tending to. Clean was a feeling. You weren't clean by any normal measure. Your clothes were stiff. Your nails stained. Your scalp full of unwelcome guests. But sometimes, after wiping your face, or changing your shirt, or soaking your feet, you felt different. You felt awake, grounded, human. That was enough. The ritual of feet every few days. You sat down and took off your boots. That act alone was significant. You rubbed your feet with a cloth, dried them near the fire, picked out pebbles and grit. Sometimes someone helped. A daughter, a friend, a quiet neighbor. You didn't speak much. You just sighed, and that was comfort. Hands held for scrubbing washing someone else's hands was a gesture of love. You poured water over their fingers, watched the grime swirl, scrubbed with your thumbs. No one asked for it, but it was never refused. It said, I see you, you matter. Let me help. Hair was hope braiding. Someone's hair wasn't vanity. It was a promise that there would be another morning, that someone would see the braid and know you had care. Time, presence. It was survival, expressed in twine and patience. The sound of a clean shirt that had been soaked and dried made. A particular sound, a creak, a crackle. You put it on carefully, felt the seams settle against your skin. It didn't smell good, but it smelled different, and that was enough to make you smile. Fresh socks meant a better day. You changed socks like someone opening a gift, even if they were damp, even if they were patched with thread, they felt new. You walked differently when your feet were wrapped in something cleaner than yesterday. You walked taller, a rag on the forehead when the sun hit hard. Someone always had a rag. They soaked it, folded it, placed it gently on your forehead. You closed your eyes. You didn't need to speak. The gesture said everything. Rest now. You are being cared for. Helping someone comb their hair, this wasn't grooming. It was mercy. Their hands were tired, their fingers too swollen. You held the brush, worked slowly, said nothing. They sighed when it was over, and you felt better, too. The cleanest among you, there was always one woman, one man, who stayed cleaner than the rest. You didn't know how. They just did. Their shirts looked sharper, their braids tighter, their hands steadier. They inspired you, not with envy, but with gratitude, because they reminded you it was still possible. When illness made clean impossible, the sick couldn't clean themselves, so someone else did, wiped their mouth, cleaned their hands, combed their hair. Sometimes they were unconscious, sometimes they wept with shame. You did it anyway, because they would have done it for you. Children who bathed when you had time, you washed the children. You sang while you did it. You told stories. You made bubbles out of hope. They laughed, kicked, got water everywhere, and you smiled, because the sound of a clean child's laughter made all the labor worthwhile. When the whole wagon was washed once, maybe twice, you reached a river and decided, today, we clean everything, blankets, clothes, bedrolls, bodies. You spent the entire day soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, and at sunset, everything fluttered in the wind. It smelled like effort, like campfire, like pride. You slept well that night. Cleanliness as resistance. The world out here wanted to grind you down, make you into something unrecognizable. But every time you washed your hands, brushed your hair, straightened your clothes, you resisted. You said, I am still here. I still care. And that mattered more than anything. Lice didn't win, they came. They itched. But you combed them out, washed, rubbed vinegar into your scalp. You didn't win the war, but you won small battles, and each battle meant something. Fire was for warmth, and water you boiled water, not just to drink, but to clean. that hiss of hot metal, that swirl of steam, that moment of dipping a cloth into something warm. It was more than practical, it was ritual. You could smell better than before you. Didn't expect to smell good, but when someone came near and didn't flinch, you felt proud. When they said, "You smell like soap," even if faintly you smiled, that was a kind of victory, dignity in the smallest things. Ducking your shirt in, wiping dust from your face, rinsing your teeth with a mouthful of warm water. These weren't acts of survival, they were acts of dignity. And out here, that was everything. Clean wasn't a condition, it was a feeling, and no matter how far the trail stretched, how dusty your boots became, or how long since your last bath, you found a way, you always did. Let's now step gently into another time, another thread in the tapestry of the trail. Story 2, Sleeping with Vermin, the quiet hell of trail camp nights, tired but never rested. Nights on the trail, nightfall on the Oregon Trail, didn't bring peace. It brought a different kind of labor, the struggle to rest, to find comfort. Where there was none, to lie still while everything itched, creaked, or crawled. Sleep wasn't earned. It was negotiated, and even when your eyes closed, you were never really gone, because night held its own challenges, its own discomforts, its own quiet hell. Dusk was deceptive as the sun dropped behind the horizon. The land changed, the dust cooled, the wind softened. Everything glowed in gold and violet. It looked peaceful, but you knew what was coming. The camp circle was no sanctuary. Wagons were pulled into a loose ring. Fires lit in the center, but the ring didn't protect you. It didn't block the wind, didn't muffle the groans of animals, didn't keep the bugs at bay. It just marked where sleep would try to happen. The bed was the ground. You didn't sleep in a bed. You slept on canvas, or wool, or a pile of cloaks. On the hard-packed earth. If you were lucky, you cleared the rocks first. If not, you remembered them with every bruise. Bedrolls that never felt right to your bedroll, smelled of sweat and smoke. It was never truly dry, never truly soft. You shook it out before lying down, just in case something had crawled in. Then you laid still, feeling every threadbare seam. Blankets were damp, they soaked up the day's sweat, the night's dew, and the cold that clung to. Morning, you wrapped yourself in them anyway. Not for comfort, but for hope. Hope that the chill wouldn't seep into your bones. Again, sleeping in, clothes you didn't undress. You might loosen a belt, remove your boots, but your shirt stayed on. Your pants stayed tucked. The trail wasn't a place for bare skin after dark. Boots by the head, you slept with your boots nearby, sometimes under your head. Not for theft, though that happened, but to keep out spiders, and to keep them from freezing. Stiff, your boots were more than shoes. They were your feet's only home. The itch that started at night, you could ignore the bugs during the day. You were moving, distracted, but at night they came for you. They found your ankles, your scalp, your neck. You scratched until you bled. You cursed softly, then turned over and scratched. Again, mice in the wagons, you heard them first. The scratch of claws on wood, then the squeaks, then the soft thud of something falling. They were after thee. Crumbs, the bacon rind left behind. You pulled your blanket tighter, not to hide, just to pretend sharing space with strangers. You didn't always sleep alone. Sometimes you shared a blanket, or a wagon bed, or just a patch of ground. There wasn't room for modesty. You turned back to back, breathed slowly, tried not to wake each other when the cramps came. The groans of the anima's oxen lay nearby, snorted, shifted, coughed, horses stomped in their sleep. Chickens rustled in crates. Everything had breath, and all of it was louder at night. The sky was too large, he looked up, hoping for comfort, but the stars were too many. The sky too big. It made your problems feel smaller, but also your body. You curled tighter, as if to resist floating away. The air grew sharp. Wind on the prairie carried no warmth after dark. You wrapped a cloth around your neck, pulled your hat low. Still, your nose stung. Your fingers curled into fists. You learned to breathe shallowly, so the cold didn't fill your chest. Night sweats in cold air. Some nights you woke drenched, not from heat, but from fever, from fear, from dreams. You threw off the blanket, then pulled it back again. You whispered a name, then turned your face from the fire, and didn't sleep again. Dreams cut short if you dreamed. You never finished them. A noise woke you. A breeze chilled you. A sudden cramp twisted your calf. You blinked at the stars, counted the wagons, then closed your eyes again. But the dream was gone. Snoring and murmurs. Someone always snored. A child muttered in their sleep. Someone whimpered. A man gasped. A woman said a name no one recognized. You heard it all. You didn't judge. You just listened, then rolled over. Night was for thinking. You thought of home, of warm beds, of soft floors and quiet windows. You remembered the feel of clean sheets, the sound of ticking clocks. Here, there was only silence, and the slow rhythm of suffering. Sleep wasn't rest, it was surrender, and on the Oregon Trail, that surrender never came easy. Scratch, scurry, snore. The nighttime life you never wanted. Asterisk, the Oregon Trail didn't rest just because the sun went down. It shifted, changed, became something smaller, darker, closer to the earth. And in that darkness, life continued. Life with whiskers, claws, wings, sharp teeth, and twitching tails. While you tried to sleep, everything else woke up. The ground was never empty, even after clearing away rocks and pine cones. You could never be sure. Ants, beetles, earwigs, they all lived in the same soil you lay on. You shook your blankets, you tucked your pant legs, and still they found you. Bedrolls made of crumbs, everything you ate stuck to your clothes. Bits of cornbread, bacon, grease. No matter how careful, it ended up in your bedroll. The smell drew everything in. Mice, beetles, tiny things with too many legs. You learned to ignore the crawling. Most of the time, fleas were a constant. You could kill lice. You could pluck ticks, but fleas just kept coming. They lived in the seams of your clothes, hopped from one bedroll to another. You scratched in your sleep. So did everyone else. Sometimes you bled. Sometimes you woke with scabs you didn't remember. Making dot mice with bold hearts. Mice didn't fear you. Not out here. They scurried across sleeping bags, climbed into open sacks, nibbled anything soft. You felt them brush your arm at night, heard their claws on canvas. One morning, a woman found one curled beside her, dead, stiff, warm still from the blanket. She screamed, then cleaned up, then kept walking. Rats in the wagons weren't safe. If the flour barrel cracked, the rats came. You saw their droppings in the corners, heard them at night, gnawing. They chewed through wood, through cloth, through shoes. You didn't catch them. You just tried to be faster than they were. Flies that never slept even at night. They buzzed, drawn to scraps, to smells. to the backs of your ears. You waved your hand in your sleep, rolled over, covered your head, and when you uncovered it again, they were back. Coyotes and distant howls beyond the circle. In the dark, you heard howling, sometimes sharp, sometimes long and low. You clutched your blanket tighter, looked toward the wagons. The oxen stirred. The dogs didn't bark. You weren't afraid. Not exactly, just reminded that you weren't alone out here. Sleep beside the fire when the nights grew cold. You moved closer to the fire. You lay just outside its glow, close enough to feel heat, far enough not to burn. The warmth was worth it, even if the smoke choked you, even if the ashes blew into your face. Faces lit by embers, you saw others there, to dot not sleeping, just lying still, eyes open, watching the flames. Some whispered, some stared. There was comfort in it, in knowing someone else was awake, even if you never said a word. Shoes on strings, you tied your shoes together and looped them around your wrist, not from paranoia, but from mice. They'd chew the leather, carry the laces. One man woke to find only one boot left. He walked for 3 days in mismatched shoes, blankets with bites bugs, chewed fabric as easily as food. You patched holes every few days, sewed over. Seams still in the morning, new ones appeared. Little black dots, small brown tears. You stopped asking why. You just kept sewing. Breathing in dust, the night wind carried dust, fine and soft. It coated your lips, your nose, your lashes. You wiped your mouth before eating, cupped your hand before sipping water. But the dust always found its way back, the whisper of wind. Through canvas the wagon covers flapped, ropes groaned. It wasn't loud, but it was never silent. The wind made music, an eerie, constant rustle. You grew used to it sometimes. It sang you to sleep. Shared misery made it bearable. You weren't the only one, itching, scratching, sweating. Everyone. Did you saw the red marks, the scabs, the dirty collars? You offered vinegar. They shared cloths. No one pitied each other, but no one judged either. Little routines before sleep. Brushed your arms, shook your shoes, checked your blanket, wiped your face with a damp cloth. If there was water, every night, the same steps. A ritual of almost cleanliness. A promise to yourself, I'm trying. Falling asleep, mid-scratch you rubbed your calf, your shoulder, your scalp. Then your hand dropped. Sleep took you, not gently, but out of exhaustion. And in the night, the vermin kept moving. Sleep was never soft. But even in the crawling, creaking dark, you found a rhythm. And sometimes that was enough. Dreamless, restless, human, how the trail changed. Sleep *, sleep. Once a simple part of life became a stranger on the trail. It didn't come easily. It didn't stay long. It didn't soothe. And yet you kept chasing it every night, as faithfully as you walked by day. But the trail didn't offer sleep. Not the deep kind. Not the healing kind. It offered something else. Survival, barely rested, barely sane, still breathing. You forgot what rest felt like real sleep became. A memory, soft sheets. Silence, a room without movement. You tried to remember the feeling, the weightless drift, but it slipped away. Out here, sleep was like water in your hand, cool for a moment, then gone. Dreams came in snippets. When sleep did come, it brought strange dreams, unfinished scenes, fragments of voices. You dreamed of walking, of sewing, of stirring soup. You dreamed of chores, of people you didn't recognize. And then you woke up, unrefreshed. Waking felt like drowning. You opened your eyes gasping, not from fear, from fatigue. Your limbs ached. Your skin burned. Your mind was fog. It took minutes to orient yourself. You sat up slowly and started another day. The world lost its edges when you never fully slept. Reality blurred. You forgot words. You stared into nothing. You walked when you meant to rest. You rested when you should have moved. Nothing felt sharp anymore. Even your thoughts were wrapped in gauze. You snapped more easily. A dropped spoon became a crisis. A question felt like an insult. You didn't mean to be short, or cold, or silent. But sleep deprivation made everything louder, harder. You apologized more often and meant it less. Children cried at night. They didn't always know why. They weren't hungry, weren't sick, just tired, overwhelmed. They whimpered in their blankets, called out for names that weren't there. And someone, always someone, held them until they slept again. Tempers flared at dawn. The hours before sunrise were hardest. Everyone was awake, but no one admitted it. The fire wouldn't start. The biscuits burned. You snapped at your spouse. Avoided your neighbor's eyes. By noon, it passed. But every morning began. In silence, lovers slept back to back. There was no room for closeness. Blankets were thin. Space was tighter. But still, fingers brushed. Legs touched. You didn't whisper sweet words. You just breathed in sync. That was intimacy now. Breathing. Together, illness came faster without sleep. Your body weakened. Your cough lingered. Cuts festered. Your legs felt heavier. You stopped noticing the signs until you collapsed beside the fire. And someone said, softly, you need to rest. The fire was your blanket on the coldest nights. You lay inches from flame. Your boots smoked. Your blanket steamed. You didn't care. Warmth was worth the risk. Even if you dreamed of burning, you counted the stars as distraction. Some nights you couldn't sleep at all, so you stared upward, counted constellations, invented names, told yourself stories. You couldn't rest your body, so you rested your mind. Some slept sitting there, backs against wagons, their arms folded. It wasn't sleep, but it wasn't waking either. They blinked slowly, nodded. They didn't lie down, didn't close their eyes. They just paused. The first to sleep always suffered. The early sleepers were bitten, bothered. They woke first, too confused and unrested. You learned to wait, to lie in silence until your eyes wouldn't stay open, even if that meant you only slept an hour. Blankets became barriers. You wrapped them around yourself like armor, against cold, against sound, against thought. They weren't soft, but they were yours, and you pulled them tighter every night. Snoring was a gift if someone snored. You knew they were okay. Their breathing was strong. Their body relaxed. It annoyed you, but deep down you envied them. You measured distance by sleep. You'll get good rest at the next fort. There's a grove by the river. The ground's soft there. You didn't think in miles anymore. You thought in naps, in hours of sleep owed. You longed for a pillow, a real one, not a boot, not a sack. A pillow with weight, with cotton, with memory. You dreamed of it, of sinking into something that held your head like it mattered. You forgot how to be still, Evan, in moments of calm. You shifted, twitched. Your body didn't trust stillness. It had learned that stillness meant exposure, so it braced. Always, even in sleep, you slept because you had to not, because it felt good, not because it was restful, but because you would break without it. Sleep was no longer rest. It was a tool, a chore, a brief escape. And when morning came, you opened your eyes and did it all again. Let's now leave the night behind and enter a new moment in forgotten history. Story 3. Boredom, banter, and burnt biscuits. Inside a wagon trains, social life, the long silence between the miles. The Oregon Trail is remembered for hardship, for rattling wagons, thunderclaps of sickness, the scratch of brush and boot. But most of the time, it was quiet, not tragic, not dramatic, just long. The real challenge wasn't starvation or stampede. It was the hours, endless, uneventful, the steady rhythm of walking, of dust, of sameness. And in that sameness, something remarkable happened. People invented life. Days measured by footsteps. Day was thousands of steps. Boots on packed earth. Wagon wheels creaking. Hooves lifting and falling. You didn't look ahead. You looked down at the next step. And the next. That's how time passed. One footprint at a time. The silence of walking, you didn't talk much during the day. Breath was precious, dust filled your mouth. You walked beside others, often without a word, not from distance, but from rhythm. Your silence was shared, companionable. Steady children asked, "Are we there yet?" Of course, they did. But there was no there. Just another patch of earth, another stretch of sky. So, you answered kindly, or distracted them. You pointed at clouds, at birds, at rocks. You turned monotony into curiosity. Games without toys, children played with sticks. With shadows, they raced ants, built towers from stones. They made rules only they understood. And when they laughed, you remembered what joy sounded like. Songs for the road, sometimes someone sang. Old hymns, drinking songs, nonsense rhymes. It wasn't performance, it was endurance. You sang to pace the walk, to hold your breath steady. And when others joined in, the dust didn't seem so heavy. Jokes that weren't funny, but worked. They weren't clever or sharp. But someone always tried. A pun, a mispronunciation, a nickname. You laughed because laughter made the road shorter, even if just by an inch. Nicknames, born from blisters, Three-Toe Tom, Cranky Sue, Hatchet Hannah. Nicknames came from accidents, from habits, from meals gone wrong. They stuck, they softened you, made you more than just a walker in the dust, talking about nothing at night. You sat by the fire and talked, not about tragedy or goals, but about bread, about weather, about which tree looked like a horse. You talked because you were alive, and language needed to move, just like your feet. Banter as medicine, teasing was survival. When the wheel broke, someone said, "Good thing you're not in charge of clocks." When the beans burned, you said, "Adds flavor." When your shirt tore, you said, "Fashion's changing anyway." This was how you kept despair at bay. Stories that grew in the telling. A bear became 10 feet tall. A snake had feathers. You knew it wasn't true, but you told it anyway, because stories filled the silence. And sometimes you needed wonder more than fact. Gossip kept everyone honest. Who liked whom? Who stole a biscuit? Who had lice? It wasn't cruel. It was currency. It reminded you that even out here, society still existed, that eyes were watching, and mouths remembering. Sharing recipes for non-existent ovens. I once made cornbread with honey. Used to put lard in biscuits. Made crisp. These stories were half hunger, half nostalgia. They tasted better in memory, but they were shared like treasure. Dreams of towns not yet built. Some spoke of Oregon, of farms, of rivers, of cabins with glass windows. You spoke in detail because the more you described it, the more real it became, and the more worth it the journey seemed. Letters. Never Sensum wrote letters in their heads, to mothers, to friends. 2 children buried along the way. They whispered them before sleep. The ink never touched paper, but the words lived. Somewhere the comedy of shared misery. I think my socks stood up and walked away, my stews trying to escape the pot. Misery became a sketch comedy, because laughing at it made it tolerable. You laughed because crying took more energy. Companionship in chores. Someone stirred while you fetched water. Someone patched while you peeled. Chores weren't assigned. They flowed. You worked beside each other in silence, and when you caught eyes, you smiled. That was enough, sitting in circles. Saying nothing some nights, no one talked. You just sat, watched the fire, listened to wind. Your thoughts wandered together. You didn't need to fill the silence. You just needed not to be alone in it. Finding peace in repetition, the days were the same. Wake, walk, eat, walk, sleep. But within that sameness, there was comfort, because predictability, even when boring, was safer than surprise. You didn't journey to find excitement. You journeyed to survive. And in the dullest moments, you found humanity, soft, resilient, enduring. How to build a society in a circle of wagons, out on the Oregon Trail. Your town was temporary. Your neighbors changed when wagons fell behind or pulled ahead. Your leaders were elected by hands raised under open sky. There were no buildings, no post office, no sheriff, and yet there was a society, fragile, improvised, but real. The fire was the town square every night. The fire brought people together. Not everyone spoke. Not everyone stayed long. But it was the place where meals were shared, where songs were tried, where news or gossip flowed. If you wanted to feel human again, you sat by the fire. Rules made in whispers. No one wrote down laws, but you knew not to shout at night, not to borrow a pot without asking, not to lie about your supplies. Rules lived in tone, in silence, in the looks exchanged across stew pots, and they were obeyed more often than not. Leaders without titles, someone always stepped forward. When the wheel broke, when food ran low, when tempers flared, they weren't elected, but people followed them. They spoke calmly, carried tools, shared extra matches. Leadership wasn't loud out here. It was quiet, competent presence. Meals as meetings, food gathered people. It wasn't just for eating. It was for listening, laughing, complaining. You passed biscuits, drank from shared cups and the conversation, wandered from weather to dreams, to who snored the loudest. Everyone had a job, even the lazy ones. Some walked ahead to scout. Some gathered firewood. Some cooked, even if badly. Even those who seemed to do nothing somehow contributed. They told stories, kept spirits up, and when they weren't around, they were missed more than expected. Love, whispered and sloth, were crushes, quiet glances, braids undone by the same hand that helped tie them. You didn't have time for romance, but it happened anyway. It lived in shared canteens, in blushes behind wagons, in 2 people laughing over the same burnt bread. Fights were rare, but remember day's stolen ration. An insult to sharp voices raised. Once or twice, fists, but always someone intervened. Not with threats, with presence, with reminders of what mattered, because a split group was a dangerous group. The matchmakers fire some older women quietly nudged younger ones toward the respectable boys. Sit beside him, he shares his cornbread. His boots are patched, means he plans ahead. It wasn't courtship. It was math. Partnership meant survival. Secrets shared in the dark you told. Someone about your brother's death. About the child you buried in Kansas. About the reason you left Missouri. You didn't plan to share, but the night invited truth, and the person beside you simply listened. Laughter as lifeline. You laughed at spilled beans, at lost socks, at jokes made of nothing. Laughter didn't fix anything, but it made the day shorter, and that was sometimes enough. You got to know the walks. You could tell who was approaching by the sound of their boots, by the rhythm of their steps. That's Henry, you'd say, without looking. He walks with a squeak now. It was comfort, like a bell in a familiar town. Children formed tribes. They didn't care about whose wagon was richest. They roamed together, created games, whispered behind barrels. They swapped mothers when one was busy, shared bruises, and formed friendships that would outlast the trail. Storytellers were sacred. Someone always had a tale about a storm, a ghost, a bear that danced. They were asked to speak every night, even when tired, even when hoarse, because stories were more filling than stew. Sunday didn't have to be religious. Even if you didn't pray, you still paused. You wore your cleaner shirt. You spoke softer. Children played quieter. Adults stared longer at the sky. Sunday wasn't sacred because of God. It was sacred because it was different. Music that came from anything, a fiddle, a mouth harp, a tin pan tapped in rhythm. It didn't have to be good, just human, just enough to carry a tune into the prairie wind. Borrowed items, never quite returned. You lent a pot lid, a spoon, a length of rope. You forgot about it. So did they, but months later, someone handed you something else, a piece of leather, a threadbare scarf. No words were spoken, but it balanced the scale. Grudges slept lightly. You didn't hold on to anger, not for long, because tomorrow you'd need each other again to fix the wheel, to find the ox, to bury the lost. So you forgave. Not because you forgot, but because there was no other choice. Saying good night was a kindness. You didn't have to say it, but when someone did, you remembered, because even after lice, beans, blisters, and long silences, someone still wanted you to sleep well. A society doesn't need walls or laws. It needs fire. It needs stories. It needs people trying their best in close proximity. On the Oregon Trail, the community wasn't perfect, but it held, and that was its quiet miracle. After the trail, what we remember, what we let go, the Oregon Trail didn't last forever. Eventually, the wheels stopped turning. The land was staked. Cabins were raised, and slowly the circle of wagons scattered. Some settlers stayed close. Others drifted farther, but all of them, every last one, carried with them something harder to build than a house. The memory of having once belonged. The end was quieter than expected. No brass bands, no flags, just a final camp, a goodbye fire, and then wagons peeled off. 2 valleys, 2 rivers, 2 plots of land that looked exactly like everywhere else, but meant something different now. People promised to visit. They hugged. They shook hands. You better write, someone said. Don't forget the biscuits. Everyone nodded. Some meant it. Some didn't. But no one admitted that this, right now, was probably the last fire they'd share. Some friendships vanished. Overnight, no fights, no betrayal, just life, distance, new responsibilities, seasons passing. You'd remember their laugh, their smell, the way they snored or said supper like sapper. But you wouldn't see them again. Others became family you shared too much, not to stay close. You knew each other's secrets, blisters, grief, bad breath. You had eaten beans beside them, day after day. Now you built fences side by side, watched. Children play. You didn't talk about the trail. You didn't have to. Fires burned in new places, the same cast iron pot. The same crooked ladle. You cooked over new flames. But your hands remembered the rhythm, and sometimes, as smoke curled into evening sky, you smiled, because for a moment it felt like the trail again. You missed the simplicity, not the discomfort, not the hunger, but the clarity. Every day had one goal: keep moving. Every choice was immediate. Now there were fences to mend, markets to navigate, letters to write. You missed when survival was the only thing you had to do. Boredom was a bond you didn't remember the miles, you remembered the jokes, the bad stew, the rain that soaked everyone's socks. Those moments, dull as they were, glittered in memory. They had texture, smell, meaning. They mattered more than gold. You remembered the voices, her laugh when the biscuits caught fire, his snore like a drowning frog, the way someone hummed the same 4 notes every night without fail. Long after names faded, the sounds stayed. You'd hear them in the wind and feel less alone. You tried to explain years later. Someone would ask, what was the trail like? You'd smile, try to answer. But what could you say? It was long, dirty, funny, awful. It was beautiful. It was boring. It was everything. Children born after didn't understand. You told them stories about stew gone wrong, about dancing with strangers. Under stars, they laughed, but they didn't get it. How could they? They never walked 5 miles for water. Never shared a bedroll with a girl named Pepper just because the night was cold. You wrote about it, sometimes in journals, in letters, on scraps. You wrote about the ones who died, the ones who lived too loudly, the ones who whispered kindness into your ear when you couldn't keep walking. You wrote because you wanted to remember, even when it hurt. You missed the way time moved, was slow, like molasses, but it was yours now. The days rushed, the seasons blurred, but on the trail, every sunrise was a milestone, every step a line in a poem. Some built towns together. You saw familiar faces in new places. The woman who taught your daughter to braid, the boy who used to juggle apples. Now they ran shops, schools, churches. You nodded in the street. Trail people, always recognizable. The pot with a dent it hung above your hearth, still blackened, still slightly bent. You could have thrown it out, but you'd be, because when you stirred stew in that pot, you remembered the hatchet that saved a wagon. You kept it, rusted, blunt, not because it was useful now, but because it once meant survival, and because someone had lent it to you without hesitation. Stories told in winter when the snow came and the evenings stretched long. You talked. You told the children about sunburned lips, cow pies, and a song someone sang every night for 3 months. You didn't talk about hardship. You talked about people. A letter that arrived years late from a girl you shared apples with, from a man who used to fix broken axles. The writing was shaky. The ink faded, but you read it 3 times, then folded it gently and smiled. You remembered the burnt biscuits of all things, the biscuits too hot, too hard, sometimes dropped in the fire, but everyone laughed, ate them anyway, now, every time. You smelled flour, you felt warm, and hungry for something more than food. Boredom made you brave. You didn't know it then. But it wasn't hunger or sickness that tested you. It was tedium, repetition, dust, and then you survived. You kept walking and built a life from burned bread and whispered jokes. People think hardship bonds us, but sometimes it's the nothing, the waiting, the quiet acts of normalcy. That's what makes us family on the trail. You built a society without walls, and in memory it still stands. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Story 4. Prairie teeth and makeshift medicine, dental disasters on the trail. Asterisk. Toothaches in the middle of nowhere. Asterisk. There was no dentist on the Oregon Trail, no reclining chairs, no Novocaine, no waiting rooms with neat stacks of pamphlets, just you, your molars, and a journey that shook your jaw for 2,000 miles. Pain came in the smallest forms, a cracked tooth, a swollen gum, the faint throb beneath the cheekbone that warned something bad is coming, and once it started, there was nowhere to run. It started with a twinge, just a sharp flash, a bolt behind the eye. You winced, pressed your tongue to the spot. Maybe it was just a grain of grit. Maybe it would pass. You didn't speak of it. Not yet. Every bite became test cornbread, beans, salt pork. Each meal was an experiment in pain. You chewed on the other side, ate slower, and when something too hard struck the tender place, you flinched so hard your neighbor noticed. You didn't talk about toothaches. To complain was to invite pity, or worse, suggestions. Just wiggle it loose. Let me look with the knife. I got a string and a tree right over there. So you smiled thinly, nodded dot, and prayed it went away. The wagon's rattle made it worse. Every bump, every lurch, every axle groan. The trail shook you like a stone in a tin can. Your teeth clacked with each jolt. The sore one sang louder. It wasn't just pain, it was percussion, constant, relentless. You tried everything, first salt water, chewing tobacco, dabbing ash with a rag. Some said clove oil worked, but you didn't have cloves, so you tried whiskey. And a cloth soaked in cool water and biting down on leather and silence. There were no mirrors. You couldn't see what was happening, only guess. Feel the swelling, taste the copper, smell the rot. You asked someone to look once. They winced, said nothing. That silence said more than any diagnosis. You heard the horror stories. Old Tom had one swell so big it closed his eye. Sally lost half her jaw from a tooth. They pulled it with pliers. He passed out. Didn't wake up for hours. You listened in dread, then checked your breath and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come. The pain had its own clock. Worse at night, throbbing, hot. You paced, sat up, walked circles around the wagon. Others stirred, asked if you were sick. You lied. Just couldn't sleep. Just restless. Morning brought no relief. You swallowed bread without chewing. You flinched when cold water touched your tongue. You smiled less, spoke softer, but still the pain stayed. A quiet companion. Then it got worse. The cheek swelled. Your jaw locked, and your ears started to ring. The others noticed. Someone offered whiskey. Someone else offered a rock to bite down on. They meant well, but you saw the fear in their eyes. They knew what came next. The trail didn't stop for toothaches. Shoes still had to walk, still had to stir stew, still had to gather kindling. No one said, rest, because there was no resting on the trail, only enduring, and the pain kept beating like a second heart. Some tried to ignore it, they said, "I'll wait till Oregon." As if pain could be postponed, as if the body understood ambition. Some made it, some didn't. You bit down on the wrong thing, a pebble, a bone, a burnt crust, and the tooth cracked. The pain exploded. You fell to your knees, eyes watering, breathing shallow. Someone came running. It was time. The extraction was simple and horrible. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, just a tool, maybe pliers, maybe a spoon, maybe a sharpened hook. You lay on your back, someone held your arms, and then pull. You screamed, not from surprise, from release. Blood filled your mouth warm. Metallic, the pain shifted. Not gone, just different. Your body shook, your eyes swam. Someone whispered, "It's out." You didn't answer. You just let the world fade for a little while. Recovery wasn't rest. You had to keep walking, even with blood crusting on your chin, even with a hole in your jaw. There was no bed, only trail. You rinsed with whiskey, it burned, but you welcomed it. The sting felt clean, felt earned. You swished, spat, swished again, until the taste of metal gave way to bitterness. You slept, finally for the first time in days. The ache faded, the pounding slowed. You slept on hard ground, with sore limbs, with dried blood on your collar. But you slept. The tooth became a story later by the fire, someone asked. You shrugged, tapped your jaw. Gone now, they nodded, then passed the stew. Pain was constant on the trail, but tooth pain, it was personal. It stole your thoughts, it silenced your laughter, and when it finally ended, you were never quite the same. Bitter herbs and borrowed courage, healing without a hospital asterisk on the Oregon Trail. Medicine wasn't sterile. It didn't come in bottles, vials, or wrapped in clean gauze. It came in pouches of dried leaves, in spoons of bacon grease, in the shaking hands of someone who'd once helped birth a goat back in Missouri. When you fell sick, you didn't ask, "Where's the doctor?" You asked, "Who's done this before?" The medicine box was always too small, tucked into a corner of the wagon. A chipped tin, a bundle of cloth, a few tiny glass bottles that clinked with every jostle dot inside. Turpentine, castor oil, Epsom salts, maybe laudanum if someone had splurged. But no matter what you packed, it was never enough. Most cures came from plant siaro to stop bleeding, sage for fevers, peppermint for nausea, slippery elm for cough. You brewed teas from anything green and vaguely familiar. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they just filled time until the body healed, or didn't. Everyone became a healer eventually. The woman who hated blood became the best at lancing boils. The boy who'd never finished school became the tooth puller. You learned because you had to, because someday someone would scream your name. Not out of anger, but pain, and you'd have to answer. Knowledge passed from mouth to mouth. No books, no charts, just stories. My mother used this for cough. Grandpa swore by boiled onions and mustard. The cures came laced with memory, and faith. Mustard plasters and onion poultices, spread them across chests. Rubbed them into backs, hot, pungent, watering. The patient coughed, cried, cursed. But afterward, they breathed a little easier. Sometimes bloodletting didn't disappear. Some still believed it worked. A small slice, a trickle, a hope that the bad humors would leave with the blood. Others watched. Uneasy, it felt more like desperation than science. But desperation was the only doctor most days. Lancing boils required steady hands, stronger stomachs. The bulge would rise, red, angry, alive. You'd heat the knife, hold your breath, and press. The relief was immediate. The smell unforgettable. Whiskey was both cure and comfort you, poured it over wounds. You made the fevered drink it, you used it to numb, to clean, to forget. A flask passed around a fire wasn't always about cheer. Sometimes it was about pain. When someone collapsed, you took turns tending the sick. Wasn't a one-person job. Someone changed the cloths. Someone sang quietly. Someone kept the fire. The work shifted, the burden shared. Even if no one said a word, fevers brought nightmares. The sick muttered, cried out, called for mothers long buried. You wiped their brow, whispered nonsense, and when they quieted, you feared the silence more than the noise. Broken bones had to be set immediately. The pain was sharp, the moment brief, a snap, a scream, then a splint, rough and uneven, branches, belts, torn shirts. The limb would never look the same, but it might still work. Infection was the real enemy. You watched for swelling, red streaks, that awful smell. You boiled water, changed cloths obsessively, but sometimes the wound turned anyway, and you prepared for goodbye. You whispered to the dying even. If they were beyond hearing, you told them about sunshine, about the trees they'd pass tomorrow, about someone who loved them. You made up stories, sang lullabies, because there was nothing else left to do. No one died alone. That was the rule. No matter how busy, no matter how tired, someone stayed, held their hand, even if it was just a stranger, because death deserved company. The survivors always felt strange, not grateful, not guilty, just strange. As if the world had shifted and left them behind. They walked slower for a few days, laughed quieter then. Life resumed. Your medical tools were improvised. Zay's sewing needle became a suture kit, a belt, a tourniquet, a clean spoon, if you had one, doubled as a tongue depressor, or a last resort, tooth lifter. Pregnancies were feared and celebrated. Some women gave birth on the trail, in grass, in wagons, in cold. Sometimes the baby cried. Sometimes it did. There were no guarantees, just towels, hot water, and hope. You couldn't always tell what worked. The herbs, the prayers, the poultices. Sometimes the body healed because it was strong. Sometimes, despite your efforts. Sometimes not at all. But you tried anyway, because trying was the only thing you had left. And when someone said thank you, with weak breath and watery eyes, you believed, just for a moment, that it had made all the difference. The trail didn't have doctors, but it had humans, and that, most days, was enough. Memory, mercy, and the quiet work of healing, pain teaches. Not with lectures or lessons, but with silence, with waiting, with breath held in the dark. And on the Oregon Trail, every person who fell ill became a teacher. Every recovery, a tiny miracle. Every act of care, a quiet revolution. Healing didn't always mean a cure. Sometimes it just meant being there. You remembered the fever knot, because it was dramatic. But because someone held your hand while you burned. You remembered the cloth on your forehead, the quiet humming, and the moment you knew you'd live, because someone stayed. They remembered the care. You didn't do much, just sat beside them, changed a bandage, offered broth, but to them it was everything. They looked at you differently afterward, as if you'd touched their soul and left it steadier. Byrne became a Bonder boy who burned his leg. You carried him for 3 days. He barely spoke after that, but years later, in Oregon. He brought you a sack of flour without being asked and said, simply, "You once carried me." That was enough. Some wounds never closed. Not all pain left the body. A cough that lingered. A limp that worsened. You adjusted, laughed about it, called it my trail souvenir. But every step reminded you, you didn't pity the sick, because tomorrow, it might be you. The line between caretaker and patient was thin, so you offered help without pity, and accepted help without shame. Children watched and learned. They watched you wrap wounds, crush herbs, whisper comfort. They mimicked your touch, your silence, and one day, when you were the one who groaned, they sat beside you and did the same. Illness made strangers into family. A woman you barely knew washed your back. A man you feared once dug your toilet pit when you couldn't walk. Illness erased distance, because weakness wasn't a flaw out here, it was shared. Trust was built through blood, not through words. Not through promises, but through wounds, bandages, scar tissue. You knew who would stay when you couldn't move, and who you would stay for in return. Touch became sacred. You didn't touch often, not out here, but a hand on the shoulder, a damp cloth, fingers brushing yours as they passed the cup. It meant everything, more than language. You whispered the same prayers even if you weren't religious, even if you didn't believe. You whispered the same words anyway, because hope, like medicine, didn't have to be explained to work. Death taught you to cherish you lost people, too many dots, and that made the living matter more. You said their names more often, looked longer, held on tighter, even if just with your eyes. Recovery was an instant. They sat up slowly, ate in silence, slept too much. You waited, didn't rush them. Healing took time. Sometimes that was the hardest part. You told stories of survival not for pride, but for connection. You remember when Ruth burned her hand, when Elias broke his toe and we carried him on a wheelbarrow. Laughter mixed with memory, and somehow it made the trail seem softer. The worst pain didn't leave scars, no bruises, no bandages, just the ache of watching someone fade. You learned that grief could live in a smile, and that some wounds were invisible, but real. Kindness was the greatest cure, more than herbs, more than rest. Kindness kept people alive. A warm blanket, a shared biscuit, a joke whispered at just the right time. You saved lives without realizing it. You didn't always understand what you did. You pressed herbs into someone's chest and the fever broke. You repeated the same with someone else, and they died. It didn't make sense, but you kept trying anyway. Healing meant learning to forgive yourself for not knowing more, for not saving them, for doing your best and still losing. You forgave, eventually, because they would have to. You walked differently afterwards, straighter, more aware. You noticed limps, watched for coughs, and always carried a little more water, just in case. In Oregon, you built a shelf for herbs. You hung the pouch that once held yarrow, laid out bottles with names you learned to pronounce softly. You didn't need them anymore. Not urgently, but you wanted them close. You never became a doctor, but you became something just as sacred. A witness, a helper, a keeper of breath. On the trail, medicine was not a miracle, but healing, slow, imperfect, full of mercy. That was the miracle. Let's now drift into a different time, a different place. Story 5. The longest mile, final burials and farewells on the Oregon Trail. Death in a land that would not wait. Death did not wait for good timing. It didn't pause for scenery or weather. It came when the wheels creaked worst, when water ran dry, when spirits were thinnest, and on the Oregon Trail, death came often, quietly, crudely, and always too soon. But the trail didn't stop for the dead. And so you learned to say goodbye while still walking. It began with a slower walk. Someone lagged behind, stumbled more, ate less. They didn't complain, not yet. But you noticed, because slowing down meant something was coming, and you began to worry. The body spoke before the words did, a raspy breath, a paler face. You saw it in the way they stared into the distance, unfocused, the way their shoulders slumped, heavy with more than weight. Their silence said everything. Some spoke their goodbyes. Early they knew. They whispered instructions about boots, about letters, about who to watch over. They didn't cry, they were too tired, but their eyes begged you to remember. Not everyone had time to say goodbye. Sickness could take a turn fast. One day walking, the next fever, and the day after silence. You wished for a moment more, but the trail took it away. The earth wasn't always willing. You dug into clay, into rock, with hands, with pans, with whatever tools remained. Sometimes the grave was too shallow, but you had no choice. Stones were scarce. You marked it with a wheel rim, a broken crate, a bundle of sticks, anything to say. Someone rests here, someone loved, someone lost. Prayers were short. You didn't have a minister, but you had a voice. You said their name, shared a memory, asked the wind to carry them, and then silence. Children watched quietly. They didn't cry. They didn't ask questions. They just watched, learning how the trail shaped grief into a routine, how goodbyes could be quiet and fast, and final dots. Some sang softly, a hymn half remembered, a lullaby once sung beside a cradle. The notes rose gently like smoke and drifted out over the prairie. Afterward, no one spoke for a while. The wagon rolled on. The sun rose like it. Didn't notice. You walked 8. Walked again, because life didn't pause for morning. It just continued. Quieter. Grief came in waves sometimes, while stirring stew, or watching dusk settle. You remembered their laugh, their boots, the way they chewed, and you stopped. For just a moment, let the ache pass through you. Burials were done by those with strong arms, not because they didn't care, but because they had to, because digging meant time, and time meant survival. Everyone took turns carrying the news, digging, holding a child. There was no designated mourner. Grief was shared like a blanket passed around fire. You didn't want to be the next one, but you wondered, how would it feel? Would someone say your name kindly? Would they remember your stories? Some graves were hidden, covered with stones, made to look like nothing, so animals wouldn't dig, or thieves wouldn't know there was anything left to take. Some were left behind, without mark, because the trail pulled too hard, because there were no tools, because the sun was already setting still. You remembered every bump in the trail had a name now. That was near Thomas, just past where little Annie rests. The land was a map of memory. Some died holding hands, mother and child, 2 brothers. You buried them together because their stories were joined, even in rest. You whispered to the ground, promised to remember, to speak their name again when you reached Oregon, to tell someone, anyone, they had existed. Death did not stop the trail, but the trail never forgot the dead. and neither did you. Mourning in motion, rituals of grief on the prairie asterisk. Grief is not loud when it travels. It walks quietly behind wagons, between footsteps, beneath the blankets where a child once slept. On the Oregon Trail, mourning did not look like black veils or long processions. It looked like the way someone stirred their stew, the way they tied a bonnet without humming, and though the dead were buried behind, the grief came along for the whole journey. You learned to grieve without stopping because the wagons moved on, because the oxen didn't wait, because miles lay ahead. So you mourned in motion. One step at a time. There was no time for a wake-no coffin, no linen sheets, just a blanket, sometimes a prayer, and earth. The prairie accepted bodies without ceremony, but that didn't mean they weren't honored. Grief was in the little things, say spoon left unused, a name still on the chore list, a pair of shoes someone couldn't yet throw away. These were your shrines. You whispered their names to the wind because you had no headstone, but the wind went farther than any stone could. You hoped it would carry their name to Oregon, to somewhere they never reached. Some carved markers into wood they name, a date, maybe just father or beloved, a knife pressed into pine with more tears than precision, left standing like a question in the dirt. Others used stones to tell a story, 3 small ones for children, 1 large flat for a mother, arranged in a circle or a line. You knew what they meant, even if no one else would. Singing was mourning. You sang old hymns, home songs, lullabies. Even if your voice cracked, even if you forgot the words, the tune said enough. Some people got very quiet, didn't talk, didn't eat much, just walked. Their grief was inward, a silence you respected even when it scared you. Others cried loudly, and often and you let them, because this land, this journey, was too hard for silence all the time. Children grieved differently. They asked where someone had gone. They built graves in the dirt with twigs. They forgot and remembered and forgot. Again, you made small altars, a ribbon tied to a wagon wheel, a flower tucked into a hat, spoon polished and hung on a peg. It wasn't religious, it was remembrance. Even cooking changed recipes, skipped ingredients. The fire wasn't tended as carefully. Burnt beans, tough. Bread, because food is hard when your heart is heavy. The sick were watched more closely. Every cough, every stumble. You stared too long, afraid it would be another grave. Another name added to the list in your head. That list got longer even. If you didn't write it down, you knew it by heart. The ones you lost, the ones whose laughter you still heard. At night some made promises to the dead. I'll take your daughter the rest of the way. I'll build that cabin we've talked about. I'll remember you every spring. You said it aloud and meant it. Mourning became routine. Dig, cover, speak, walk, but it never got easier, only more familiar. Your dreams were filled with them, not always sad. Sometimes you laughed together again, woke up smiling through tears. The dead were not gone. They were in your habits, in the way you stirred stew, in the song you hummed when folding cloth. You talked about them casually. John always said that wagon grease was useless. Martha hated beans. She'd be groaning now. It was a way to keep them close, to make grief manageable. Laughter was a form of mourning. You joked about the bad teeth, the loud snores, the time they spilled water on the fire, because remembering joy is also remembering love. Grief did not have a grave on the Oregon Trail. It had a path, and it walked with you every step of the way. Shadows at the homestead, remembering the ones left behind, asterisk, you made it. You saw the tall trees of Oregon, the gentle hills, the rivers that ran like ribbons through the land. You stepped off the trail and onto a patch of earth that would become your home, but you did not come alone. Not truly, because every step forward carried a name, a face, a farewell spoken too fast, and grief, though softened by distance, was still walking beside you. You built with memory in your hands. The cabin rose slowly, each log lifted with effort, and a whisper of someone who once helped pitch tents. You laid the floor, remembered the man who carved spoons. You shaped the window, thought of the girl who never got to see Oregon's sky. The first fire felt lonely. You struck the flint, nursed the flames, but no one shared your tin cup. No one passed the beans. The silence beside you burned hotter than the coals. Their names lingered in routine. You still called out when the soup boiled, still paused to listen, for laughter, for footsteps, for anything, even though you knew they were gone. You marked time by absence. This would have been her birthday. He would have hated this weather. Dates passed like ghosts, not on a calendar, but in the marrow of memory. You built fences with grief. A ache made you work harder. Hands blistered, shoulders sore, but every fence post was a promise to live well for both of you. Children were named after the lost day baby wrapped in muslin. A new start, but their name belonged to someone gone, and when they cried, you heard two voices in one. Stories became memorials you told your neighbors. George could shoot a squirrel from 20 paces. Millie braided hair even when her hands were cracked. You didn't need gravestones. You had stories. You planted with purpose a garden, bloomed where sorrow had slept. Beans, cabbage, sweet herbs, each row dedicated silently to the ones who never tasted spring in Oregon. The land carried their memory. You saw their shadow in every path you cleared, felt them when the wind passed through your doorframe. They had not made it, but they were here, everywhere. You spoke to them, still while washing, while mending, got in quiet moments. In laughter, you didn't need a reply. The saying was enough. Others understood without words. The woman who lost her brother nodded when you fell silent. The man who buried his wife brought you seeds without asking. Grief needed no translation. It lived in glances, gestures, gently shared space. The pain faded, but never left it, dulled, became soft at the edges. But a song, a scent, a sunset could bring it rushing back, and you welcomed it, because it meant you remembered you. Visited the trail in dreams, walked alongside them again, heard them laugh, felt no pain, woke with tears and gratitude. Their absence taught you to love harder. You hugged longer, laughed louder, told stories without waiting for the right time, because you knew better now. The grave in your heart grew flowers, not just sorrow, but strength, wisdom, patience. You had become someone else, not in spite of loss, but because of it. You built a bench under a tree not marked, not announced, but you sat there when the world felt heavy, and sometimes you swore someone sat beside. You just taught the children their names told, them about prairie dust and wagon wheels, about kindness during sickness, about songs sung beside graves that they listened and carried the stories forward. You wrote it all down, not for yourself, but for the day someone asked, what was the trail like? You wrote about the living, the dying, the in-between. You wrote about love. You never forgot you. Couldn't. Not when the sun warmed your face. Not when your hands found rhythm in chopping wood. Not when quiet settled over your new land. You remembered, and you lived. Grief did not end in Oregon. It simply changed shape, from heavy footsteps to blooming flowers, from names whispered in darkness to children laughing in light. And in that gentle transformation, you found peace. Let's now drift into a different time, a different place.